I love that particular song. But you know, a lot of people lack the proper perspective for understanding that song because maybe they grew up without a father or grew up without a good father. And that's how God chooses to relate to us, is as a father. And so they understandably come to him with a handicap, not quite grasping what that means. But let me also say, for those of us who don't have that difficulty, how freely can you sing that song even when things in your life don't seem or look or feel good? You know, it's easy to say, man, God, you're a good father when you get the job you've always dreamed of, or when you get a big fat promotion with a big raise to go with it, or the person that you are madly in love with reciprocates that love back to you, or just fill in the blank. Whatever thing makes you feel good, or whatever thing would make you the happiest on earth, when that thing happens, it's pretty easy to sing that chorus. But what about when life stinks? What about when you're given a diagnosis that isn't good? What about when a loved one is taken away from you? What about when you're lied about or wrongly accused, or just everything in life seems to be going wrong? Are you able to still have that same perspective that God is good? And maybe a better question is, how could you and why would you? And I hope to answer that question today. I'm going to do a little bit more reading today than I normally would, because there's a story that I want you to see. But also, the text is going to be up there, but I'm going to summarize it too, and I'm going to go through it and skip some things just so that you get the idea. But what I want you to do is go back later and read this for yourself in Genesis chapter 37 and then chapters 38 through 50. No, I'm not reading all that. But I want you to. That's the story of Joseph. And that's what we're going to look at today. So beginning in Genesis 37, chapter 37, verse 1. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. And this is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, who was only 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, and he brought his father a bad report about them. Now Jacob loved Joseph more than his other sons, because Jacob had been born to him in his old age, and he made a robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Skip down to verse 18. But they saw him in the distance. Okay, well, let me tell you what's happened. So his father's sending him again to check on them in the field, and they're tending their father's flocks. But his brothers saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. And they sat down to eat their meal. They looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay a hand on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed, so when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. Skip down to verse 31. Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. So Joseph's a young teenager. Long story short, his brothers hated him. His father loved him. And his father sent him to spy on his brothers, which is never a good thing to do with your kids, so don't do that. And so they see him coming. They work out this plot to throw him in the cistern and figure out what to do with him. A band of Ishmaelites come along. They sell him to them, and then they take him to Egypt and sell him to Potiphar. That's where we pick up in chapter 39. So Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his whole household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he didn't concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. So Potiphar's wife has taken a liking to Joseph, and she tries to seduce him. Joseph remains a man of integrity and refuses to do this thing, and she's relentless. She comes at him day after day after day. And one day, she plots how she's going to trick him, and everybody else is out of the house. It's just her, and Joseph comes in to do his job. And so she makes a play for him. She grabs his outer cloak to pull him to herself, and Joseph just slips out of it and runs out the door. He doesn't even want to be anywhere near. Well, then she decides, you know what? I'll show him. So she has his clothes. So she concocts a story to tell her husband. She told him this story: "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. When his master heard the story his wife told him, saying, 'This is how your slave treated me,' he burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did." Anybody picking up on a pattern yet? All right, chapter 40. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his officials, the cupbearer and the baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. After they'd been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him, "Why do you look so sad?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." Skip down to verse 12. "This is what it means," Joseph said to him. They told him their dreams. I'm just going to interpret one, or read the one. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." Verse 20. "Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. When 2 full years had passed," chapter 41, verse 1, "Joseph had a dream." Verse 8, in the morning his mind was troubled, so he sent for Pharaoh had a dream, I'm sorry. In the morning his mind was troubled, so he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them. Then the cupbearer said to Pharaoh, today I'm reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the baker and put us in prison, and we had dreams, and there was a Hebrew slave in there who was able to interpret those dreams, and everything happened exactly as he told us that they would. So Pharaoh, verse 14, sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it, but I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Verse 38, so Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So Joseph correctly interpreted Pharaoh's dream. Pharaoh was so impressed with what the Lord had done through Joseph that he put Joseph in charge of the whole country. Now, I've said a lot and I said it quick, but I wanted you to get the gist of what happened to Joseph because I want to point out a few things. Number one, Joseph was born into a dysfunctional family. His family was dysfunctional. His father had many wives, and Joseph was his next to the youngest, born to his favorite wife, the only wife he really loved. And he was born to him in his old age, and so he was his favorite, and he played favorites with Joseph. It wasn't Joseph's fault. Joseph did nothing wrong. He was just born, and he was who he was. And his father showed favoritism, and it was obvious to the other children, and it caused the other children to be embittered towards Joseph, and they hated him. Now, Joseph, even as a young man, was a man of character and integrity, and he loved the Lord, and the Lord's hand was on him even as a teenager. And he was showing him bits and pieces of the future. And Joseph, not knowing any better, partly because he was a teenager, but he was just sharing all this with his family. Wouldn't that be natural to share the things that God has shown you with the people that you love? Well, what that was doing was causing his brothers to hate him even more. They interpreted what Joseph was saying as hubris. And, you know, in Joseph's dream, he correctly saw his brothers bowing down to him. Now, I didn't read this part, but that's eventually what happens. They're starving. And so they come to Egypt, and Joseph's in charge of everything and in charge of all the grain, and they come and they have to beg for food. Now, they don't know it's their brother because he was a young man at the time. He's now 30. Keep that in mind. All this didn't happen over a course of a few weeks or a few months or a few years. He spent his entire 20s, arguably the best decade of your life, at least you feel the best, and he spent it either as a slave or in prison. His youth was taken from him. And so from 17 to 30, and then at 30 he's put in charge, and his brothers come and they do bow down before him, even though they don't know it's him. But the Lord has given Joseph, as a teenager in the home, a glimpse of the future. His brothers misinterpret what Joseph is saying as hubris, and they hate him even more. Now, to make matters worse, Joseph, being a man of integrity and of honor, even as a teenager, honored God, obeyed God, and honored his father and obeyed his father. His father told him, won't you go and check on your brothers, see what they're doing, and come back and tell me? And Joseph obeyed his father, and he honored God by obeying his father. And how did he get repaid for that? His brothers hated him so much, they betrayed him. They threw him in a pit to decide what to do with him. 11 of them wanted to kill him. Only one objected. And because of that one objection, they didn't kill him, but they made it look like he was killed so they could tell their dad, and they sold him to a bunch of slave traders. So it got him betrayed by his own brothers. He was born in a dysfunctional family, and his family betrayed him. So keep that in mind. Joseph remained loyal to God and maintained his integrity, even in the face of incredible disappointment and intense and relentless temptation. So he's sold into slavery, and he goes to work for Potiphar. Now, I can't imagine, even as a 46-year-old man, maintaining, if everything suddenly is taken away from me, and I suddenly find myself in a position I don't deserve to be in, with my freedom taken from me. At that point, having the wherewithal, as Joseph did as a 17-year-old, to say, you know what, I am where I am, I belong to the Lord, and so I'm just going to serve Him faithfully where I find myself, in the circumstance I find myself in, which is what Joseph did. And in response to that, the Lord blessed Joseph where he was. Now, keep in mind, He did not remove him from slavery. He blessed him in his slavery. He caused his master to look favorably on him and to give him full responsibility. And then the Lord blessed everything Joseph's hand touched, so that Potiphar wanted to give everything that he owned over to him. And so he remained a man of integrity. He remained a man who was loyal, even when Potiphar's wife is throwing herself at him. Now keep this in mind. Joseph's a slave, so his prospects of having his own wife are not real high. There's not a huge market out there for men who are slaves. They're not exactly the marrying kind. And so here's this woman throwing herself at Joseph, a young teenager. But he refuses. And the reason that he gives her for not refusing is twofold. One, how can I dishonor your husband who has put his trust in me? And how can I commit this great sin against God? So he does the right thing. What does doing the right thing get Joseph? Well, the woman lies about him. Her husband gets mad and throws him in prison. So he does the right thing. He gets lied about and wrongfully imprisoned. Joseph still remained loyal and true and honored God with his life, where he was, with what he had, and yet he was forgotten. So he gets thrown in jail. Now, he already didn't deserve to be a slave, and now he certainly doesn't deserve to be a prisoner. But where he finds himself, he remains loyal and true to God, and he does his best with what he has. And the Lord honors him again. Now, the Lord does not take him out of prison, even though he doesn't deserve to be there, but he honors him in prison. And the head of the prison takes notice, and he notices that the Lord is with Joseph, and everything Joseph touches prospers. And so eventually, he puts Joseph, a prisoner, in charge of all the other prisoners. And what does Joseph get in exchange for this? Well, he thought he had a break. How many times have you been in a hard spot, and you think, you know what, this is a ray of light, this is a ray of sunshine, something has come in and is about to just break all these chains and break all this darkness, and everything's about to go my way. The king imprisons his baker and his cupbearer, and they have dreams. That's Joseph's thing. And so they tell him his dreams, he interprets the dreams, and then the one guy who's going to survive, the other one sadly didn't, but that was what his dream was. He says, now look, when you return to Pharaoh's side, please remember me. Tell Pharaoh about me. And so Joseph is thinking, I imagine Joseph is thinking at that point, man, just a few more days and I'm out of here. Can you imagine that maybe his work in the prison was a little lighter the next few days? Because he's thinking, any day now, they're going to come and get me. Pharaoh's going to want to interview me, going to want to see me, and I'm going to get out of this prison, and things are going to look up for me. But day after week, after month, after year, 2 full years. No word, no Pharaoh, no cupbearer, no relief. Joseph's in prison, doing what he's been doing. But when the time was right, and I'll be honest with you, I have a much different way of keeping time than God does. Because in my estimation, the time is usually right now. Lord, it's right now to get me out of this. It's right now to relieve my suffering. It's right now to take me to the next place, to elevate me, to remove me, or whatever. But the time isn't God's time. When the time was right, now this is key, don't miss this. When the time was right, because of his circumstances and how he had responded to his circumstances, the man of God was in the right place at the right time, doing the right thing, and so God was able to use him for the purpose for which he was called. Did you catch that? because of his circumstances, because his brothers hated him, because they sold him to slave traders, because they sold him to Potiphar, because Potiphar's wife wanted him and couldn't have him, so lied about him and had him thrown in jail. And because he sat in jail for 2 full years, Pharaoh had a dream and there was nobody who could interpret the dream. And the cupbearer suddenly remembers the young Hebrew who had been kind to him in prison. Oh yeah, boss, I know a guy. He was in the right place at the right time, doing the right thing, so God was able to use him for the purpose for which he was called. Let me say, life can be so incredibly unfair. Now, let me say this. I've preached through every verse of this book. It took 13 years to do it, but went through every single verse. And nowhere in here, not even once, does it promise us that life is fair. Of course, who am I to be the arbiter of what's fair? Is it fair that I live in a country where I have freedom and I'm not hungry, and billions of other people go hungry every day? Is it fair that though I wear the same clothes year after year, I'm fully clothed? And there are literally millions of people who are next to naked. Is it fair that I have a wonderful family and children, and there are others who desire to have those things and don't have them? So really, who am I to be the arbiter of what's fair and what isn't fair? But regardless, from my perspective, life often is incredibly unfair. Job questioned why the wicked prospered while he lost everything. And he did. He lost all his children, he lost all his wealth, he lost his reputation, and he lost his health. And he's sitting in a heap of ashes with his so-called friends telling him it's all his fault when he'd done nothing wrong. And he looks out there and he sees people who don't live right, who don't care anything about the Lord, who are just pursuing their own pleasure and seemingly prospering. And he says, "Why, Lord? Why do the wicked prosper?" Joseph was arguably good. Now remember, Jesus said no one is good but God alone. But from our perspective, Joseph was arguably good, and yet it seemed as only bad things happened to him. Your life may be unfair. Your family may be dysfunctional. You might have been cheated, slighted, lied about, falsely accused, and wrongly condemned. But let me ask you, have you remained steadfast and loyal? In whatever circumstance you find you're in, have you remembered who God is and what He has promised you, or for that matter, do you even know? And the only way you know is by reading and studying and meditating and memorizing this book. Do you know what He's promised you? Do you know His character and His heart? And do you trust Him so that then no matter where you are and what circumstance you find yourself in, you can remain steadfast and loyal? Let me ask it this way. Do you serve Christ where you are with what you have as best you can? Do you serve Christ where you are with what you have as best you can? Maybe you're not where you want to be. Maybe there's a million other places you'd rather be, but you are where you are. And maybe you don't have all that you think you need or all that you would like, but you have what you have. And so where you are with what you have, are you serving Christ as best you can? Joseph rightly understood God's hand in his life. At least later in life, he was able to look back on all that had happened to him and say this. In chapter 50, verse 15, Joseph's dad has died. You know, his dad, he's brought his whole family to Egypt so that they can survive the famine, and he's been taking care of them. But then Dad dies. I mean, he's 147, so he dies. And then the brothers are understandably concerned. Okay, you know what? Maybe Joseph has only been nice to us for Dad's sake. Now, Dad's gone. So Joseph, he can do anything to us that he wants to. So when they saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father," I like how they couch that, "your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. Now, I don't know at this point necessarily why Joseph wept. I can imagine that maybe he wept because he's thinking, you know what? After all this time I've taken care of them, do they not know my heart and know that I've forgiven them and that I truly love them? Or maybe he wept because now as an older man, probably middle-aged man himself, he's thinking, that's all I wanted from them. For 30 years, I just wanted to hear them say, I'm sorry. I just wanted to hear them acknowledge that what they did was wrong. Maybe that's why he wept. I don't know. The text doesn't tell us. But when he heard what they had to say, he wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Talk about perspective. You intended to harm me. 11 of you guys wanted to kill me. Or 10, I guess. 10 of you guys wanted to kill me. But you didn't kill me. You sold me into slavery. And from there, it went from bad to worse. And I missed the entire decade of my 20s. I spent 13 years in slavery or in prison, undeservedly. You meant to harm me. But God meant what you did for good. That dream that I had back when I was a kid that made you so angry, that dream was about what's happening right now. You coming down and bowing yourselves before me wasn't because I exalted myself above you. It's because God exalted me and used me to save not only your lives, but the lives of millions of people. And the lineage of the Messiah who's yet to come. He had that perspective about what had happened to him in his life. Joseph had the correct perspective. And that perspective saved him from bitterness, unforgiveness, and hatred, all of which will destroy you. I've heard it said, and I want to be careful with this because it's true, but this isn't the primary reason why you should do this. It's often said that forgiveness isn't for you. Isn't for the other person. It's for you. It's to release you. And because unforgiveness will destroy you. And that's true. It absolutely will. That is absolutely true. And while you're sitting and stewing about something, the other person's going on and living, and you're the one stuck in the past, and you're the one stuck bearing a load or a burden that you can't bear that's going to destroy you. So it is absolutely true that when you forgive that other person, it releases that. But that's not why you do it. That's the result of doing it. That's a benefit from doing it. Why you do it is out of obedience. Why you do it is because Jesus said that if you don't forgive others, then your Heavenly Father won't forgive you. Why you do it is because when you've received grace and mercy immeasurable, you can't help but extend it to others. Why you do it is simply because Jesus asked you to. And it doesn't matter whether let me go ahead and help you. The other person doesn't deserve it. That's why you offer it, because they don't deserve it. That's what grace is. I don't deserve to go to heaven. I don't deserve to be called God's child. I don't deserve any of the blessings that He gives me. He gives me all of those, and He saves me because of His grace. I don't deserve any of it. I don't deserve to be forgiven. And whoever has harmed you doesn't necessarily deserve to be forgiven. You do it because God asked you to. So what about you? Joseph was the sum total of all that had happened to him. I want you to remember this. I don't know what all lessons Joseph must have learned during his enslavement and imprisonment, but I'm sure he learned some in order to survive. He learned about himself. He learned about people. He learned about relationships. He certainly learned patience. He learned to trust God even when it seems impossible or there's no tangible reason to do it. You know, it's easy to say that I trust God when I don't have to go out very far to do it. Oh yeah, I trust God to take care of that, and then within an hour or a few minutes or a few days, it's taken care of. Well, good. Now I move on. But what about when whatever that thing is goes on and on and on, And from my perspective, it seems forever. What is God doing? Where is He? Well, it's at that point that I must know who He is and know that He is always faithful. Know that He will never leave me or abandon me. Know that everything that happens in my life, if I belong to Him, it passes through His fingers and it has a purpose. It has a purpose for me, to shape me, to mold me into the likeness of His Son, because that is what I was predestined for. I was predestined to be made into the likeness of His Son. So everything that happens to me, because I belong to Him, pours into that. I am the sum total of all the experiences that I've ever experienced, good, bad, ugly, and otherwise. The pain that hurt so bad, that pain helped to soften my heart. That pain helped to chip away some aspect of my character that needed to be dealt with. That pain drove me to the throne because I had nowhere else to go. But there's nowhere else I need to be. Joseph was the sum total of all that had happened to him. God used all of it to shape him into the man he should be and put him in the place he should be so that he could be used by God as He had intended him to be. You are the sum total of all that has happened and will happen to you. God will use all of your circumstances, the trials, the pain, the heartache, even the joy, to make you into the man or woman He wants you to be. Remember, to put you in the right place at the right time to be used by Him if you'll just surrender and trust Him to do what is right concerning you. Will not the judge of all the earth do what is right? I freely confess I do not understand all that happens that God allows to happen. I know enough to know that if it happens, God allowed it to happen. Either allowed it or He caused it, but in either case, He could have stopped it and He didn't. So I have a decision to make. At that point of decision, knowing what I know, do I know God well enough to trust Him? God, I don't understand this. This makes no sense to me, but I know You, so I trust You know what You're doing. God, I'm in pain and that hurts and this is uncomfortable and I don't like it. But I know that You want what is ultimately good and best for me. So I surrender myself to it. Paul, when he was still Saul, the Lord appeared to him and asked him, Saul, why are you kicking against the goads? Using the King James. You know, and for a long time I thought, what in the world is that? That makes no sense to me. Well, it was an agrarian culture. And a goad was a long stick that a farmer would take and he would sharpen the end of it, essentially making a spear. And as he's plowing his field, and his plow is being pulled by oxen. They didn't have John Deere back then. And so the oxen would pull the plow, but the oxen didn't always want to go. And so he would take that sharp stick and he would poke the oxen in his hind quarters to motivate him to go. And as long as the oxen refused to go, he was going to get that pointed stick in his backside. It was pointless for the oxen to refuse, so he would just surrender and go. And that's what the Lord's point was to Paul. Saul, at the time he was still Saul, Saul, you're fighting against me. I'm the pointed stick and I'm not going anywhere. I have a plan and a purpose for you. You can either continue to resist and feel the pointed end of my stick, or you can surrender. Of course, we know the story. Well, I don't know what's happening in your life, and you don't know all that's happening in my life, but all the things that's happening in our lives, the Lord intends and will use. First for His glory, and second for our good. Do you trust Him enough to surrender to it? Lord, I don't understand it. Lord, I don't like it. But I know You. So I trust You know what You're doing. Let's pray.